Hello, I'm Mark Madison, historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'd like to very warmly welcome you to the Conservation Lecture Series at the National Conservation Training Center. We've actually been doing this lecture series for 23 years now, both in person and virtually when necessary. And today we have a wonderful speaker who I've followed his research for a number of years, and I think you're really going to enjoy his talk. So let me cut to the chase and introduce Kevin Brown. Kevin is the author of the Devils Hole Pupfish, The Unexpected Survival of an Endangered Species in the Modern American West. He earned his PhD in history at Carnegie Mellon University and was a postdoctoral fellow in environmental studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Kevin first began writing about the Devil's Hole Pupfish while working as a researcher for the American Society for Environmental History in Death Valley National Park. He currently works as a wildland firefighter in California. I actually had the great pleasure of meeting Kevin as he worked on this research and can attest that he's a wonderful person and a top-notch environmental historian. And that's exactly the type of research we try to support out here at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Archives. I think you'll greatly enjoy his presentation. And if you have any questions at all, please put them in chat and he'll answer them at the end of the show. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kevin.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for that really nice and generous introduction. And also thanks to Melissa, Randy, and Doug at Fish and Wildlife for helping put this presentation together. And also to all of you for joining in. And I look forward to any and all questions at the end. I'm also thankful to have this borrowed office space here. I'm not organized enough to have 4 calendars, but I am grateful to the Mona Lake Committee for offering me some space today. So I'll pull up my PowerPoint slides here. I'm just going to share my screen with you all. Let's see. And with any luck, you should be now seeing my title slide. Today, I want to provide an overview of the work that I've done on the pupfish and really answer 3 big questions, or at least have 3 goals in mind. And in this slide, you can see a copy of my book came out in September. It really does exist. That's it sitting on my desk. So the first thing I'd like to do is actually talk about how I arrived at the question that is at the heart of this book. So the book revolves around how is it exactly that the Devil's Hole Pupfish, one of the rarest vertebrate species in the world, has managed to survive since the 1890s during a period where we know extinction has become an important part of our narrative for species, especially aquatic species, in the West. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got there, how it is that I came to realize that was a worthy question, this question about survival. And then I'll offer an overview of my answer or my answers to that question. And then finally, just in a few minutes, describe a little bit about what I think some of the implications are for climate change. But before we get to any of that, we all need to get on the same page with what I would refer to as some Pupfish Basics. So this is Pupfish Boot Camp. We're just going to get the basics of what and how the pupfish live and where they live and all that. So this on the screen right now, you can see a Devil's Hole Pupfish. Depending on the size of the monitor that you're watching this talk on, this is magnified many times over than they are in real life. Devil's Hole Pupfish, each individual is about 1 inch long, so from the tip of your thumbnail to your first knuckle there. And they live in only one habitat, which is located on the east side of Death Valley National Park. In this map here, just from Google Maps, of the regional setting, you can see Las Vegas, and Devil's Hole is located about 90 miles west-northwest in an area called the Amargosa Desert. And then to its west is Death Valley National Park across the Funeral Mountains. So in one pool is where every Devil's Hole pupfish lives. So here's an image of Devil's Hole. I took it looking down from the visitor platform, which is about 45 or 50 feet above the pool itself. So this, just kind of imagine yourself looking downhill pretty sharply about 45 feet until that dark patch is the water, which is only about 10 feet across by 60 feet long. What you're actually looking at, and I didn't come up with this phrase, but you're looking into Devil's Hole. It's basically a window into an aquifer. The cavern above Devil's Hole collapsed some 60,000 years ago. And in this little fault here is water that comes to the surface out of this carbonate aquifer that underlays much of this area. So it's a pretty unique type of habitat. U.S. Geological Survey divers have been down to about 430 feet below the surface here, and they have seen neither the bottom, if there was such a thing, of Devil's Hole, nor have they found any evidence of the two divers who drowned there in 1965. So this tiny little fish is confined to this tiny little habitat. And what's remarkable is that they actually reproduce on an even smaller part of that tiny habitat. So in this image, I've highlighted here the shallow shelf is what the scientists who work there call this rock that is wedged below the surface of the water from just a few inches to a couple feet below the surface. It's not totally even, this shelf. And it occupies just the southernmost 20 feet of the pool itself, and then afterwards it drops off to the extreme depths. And so on this shallow shelf is where all Devil's Hole pupfish spawning and reproduction and development take place. So in what may be the most restricted vertebrate habitat in the world, an even smaller part of it is actually used for reproduction. So it's an extreme environment, and the pupfish have evolved to be able to tolerate this space. So one of the things we've learned about the Devil's Hole pupfish over the years through the National Park Service's scuba diving. They use scuba diving as a method for censusing the population. And they've done that since 1972. And so in this figure, you can see the trends in population for both the fall and the spring. And the reason why it's broken out like this is because Devil's Hole doesn't even receive direct sunlight during the winter months. And so primary production really slows down. And this also results in a drop in the pupfish population. So you can see that there's a fall maximum in the population and then a spring minimum. And we'll come back to and talk about this drop off that you can see clearly on the right side of the graph after about 1995. But it is to say the population level has always been very tiny and has not exceeded 600 individuals since this type of censusing began about 50 years ago. 50 years ago this spring. So, all right. Surrounding Devil's Hole, if you've ever been there, you know there's a chain link fence around it that the Park Service installed. The National Park Service added the 40 acres around Devil's Hole to Death Valley National Monument, as it was then called, in 1952. And a chain link fence has been around at least part of the site since the 60s. And occasionally people do break into the site. I could talk more about that. But there is an excellent High Country News article about a relatively recent break in there back in 2016. So which I think you could easily find on their website. So let's see if you're thinking to yourself, if you're watching and saying, well, I've heard of pupfish, but the story that I know about pupfish is not this story. There are, in fact, other pupfishes. So pupfish is the common name that we give to this group of fishes that are in the genus Cyprinodon. And there are a number of other pupfish species and subspecies that are scattered around springs and river systems in the U.S., in the Death Valley region, but then also in the U.S. Southwest, Mexico, the Caribbean, and there's even a member of the genus that's up on the east coast of the U.S., the sheepshead minnow. This photograph here is one I took at Saratoga Spring, which is at the southern end of Death Valley National Park. All the photographs in this presentation that are uncredited are mine, and everything else should have a credit somewhere on the slide. Okay, so here's another way to think about or to illustrate the distribution of pupfishes in the Death Valley region. So again, this is just a simple Google Maps screenshot. North is up on this map. So in the northwest corner is Bishop, California, and just north of there is where you're likely to find the Owens pupfish. And then the center of the image is Death Valley National Park. And you can see that there are 9 species or subspecies of pupfish that are sort of scattered around springs in the Amargosa River on this end of the park. So Cyprinodon diabolis, the Devil's Hole Pupfish, is just one of those. And we'll talk more. We'll come back to this map later in the talk. So what I've just shared with you about Pupfish Basics represents probably more information than I knew about the Devil's Hole Pupfish when I started researching it. I think many research projects, and those researchers who are listening know that research projects tend to have very humble origins, and mine is certainly no exception. And yeah, when I began, I didn't know very much about the Devil's Hole Pupfish, but as Mark mentioned, I had recently finished my PhD in environmental history. Environmental history is a field within the discipline of history, which is really concerned with how human relationships with the natural world have changed over time, and usually through relatively modern history. Our time scales go back, depending on the place, a few hundred to a few thousand years. And that's primarily because historians, whether a political historian, environmental historian, one of our major sources, our main method, is to use documentary records. And so we like to find what we call archival records or manuscript records, usually things that have not been published before, but we then analyze those documentary sources, wherever they come from, and also conduct interviews and read or look at maps and images to tell a story about how humans and nature have related. That's like big picture what environmental history does. You know, some of the most important environmental histories, especially those related to land management, have really come out of a strong interest in environmental history in conservation history. Those of you who work or have worked for the U.S. Forest Service or the National Park Service probably know that there are a lot of conservation histories out there about both of those agencies and about specific projects or things that they've been involved in. The Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service haven't had quite as many of their records poured over in the way the Park Service and the Forest Service has. But in addition to conservation history, a lot of really excellent environmental histories, especially focused on things like endangered species, bring in a lot of history of science, as well as sometimes political economy, thinking about the broader structures around either the place or the species that's at work. So one of my favorite environmental histories that's related to, especially one that's related to parks, is Richard West Sellers' Preserving Nature in the National Parks. It was published in the late 1990s. So it's not new, but I think is absolutely required reading when it comes to understanding the origin of protecting biodiversity in the national parks. And in many ways, I tried to model my work that I started in 2013 on Sellers' interests and his fine book. So, after sifting through records and memos and field notes and newspaper articles and reports from government offices, from people's homes, from libraries, special collections, from published sources. But for about 2.5 years, I was able to produce this report that I sent to the Park Service, and here's just an image of the report sitting in a box full of reports before it got shipped off to the Death Valley. And so I produced this report, and with the idea that its details would be really useful for those who are managing the pupfish, and also for incoming administrators at Death Valley National Park, as they thought about, okay, well, how does this issue fit into all the other things going on in Death Valley? And I would just offer a brief plug for this kind of history for management. It's not only a history of management, which I think this report did, but it's a history for management in that it is providing some lessons, as well as detailing forgotten moments or misremembered moments, and also rediscovering some things that can kind of be lost in the mix. So just one of the main lessons I offered that came out of the history of the Park Service's engagement with the Devils Hole Pupfish was the really tortured path towards instituting any serious ecological monitoring, and the ups and downs in the course of actually doing ecological monitoring, and the consequences of the moments in which they ceased to do that for the pupfish. And so I thought that was an important lesson to offer, to highlight from that history. But there are also other specific things that I came across and then would mention or write about in an email to my the people at the Park Service, like Kevin Wilson, the ecologist there, saying, okay, do you know about this? And kind of offering her, hey, I just found this. What do you know about this? And sometimes hopefully contributing something new that can build a bigger context that could be used in other kinds of documents that they produce. So none of this little backstory really answers the first part of my question, which is like, how did I arrive at the question that's in this book? Because by the time I finished writing this report, I knew a lot about the pupfish. I knew a lot about management history, but I didn't really know anything about how to turn that into a book, how to ask a question that sort of tied it all together in a way that was that would speak to a broader audience outside of management. Now, I felt like I had done a good job, but I was also rather self-conscious about this. This is, like I've been working on this for 3 years, and what's my question kind of feeling, knowing that I wanted to turn it into a book or recraft it and continue to do research. But I was really lucky to get a fellowship at that time at UC Santa Barbara. And so I moved there, and instead of being kind of pent up by myself, banging my head against the table, writing about pupfish, all of a sudden I was, hanging out with lots of people who are interested in all sorts of things. And one group I got involved in right after I arrived was a group of historians and ecologists, historical ecologists as well, who were interested in the extinction of the California grizzly bear. And here is an image here I took at the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley, because we started to look at records related to research that had gone on, and even just how these grizzly bear specimens ended up in sorry, excuse me, in the museum. And so in addition to thinking about the extinction of the California grizzly bear, after I got to Santa Barbara, I started rereading some of my favorite environmental history, including a book by Mark Barrow called Nature's Ghosts. And Barrow's book is all about the history of the idea of extinction, how in the 18th and 19th century, the idea of extinction was discovered or invented. And here you can see the Carolina parakeets specimens are used on the cover of his book. And then I was, kept reading about extinction, and read about the extinction of the great auk, shown here. So the extinction of the passenger pigeon, and here's Martha Washington, the last passenger pigeon. I started thinking about extinctions closer to home of the pupfish. The Ashimotos Poolfin, which was collected alongside the Devils Hole Pupfish for the first time in 1891, had become extinct by the 1850s. I started reading into the literature that I'm sure some of you are well versed in, about the idea of the Sixth Extinction, a phrase which has been popularized by Elizabeth Colbert's nice book on the topic, but it has a much longer history. And here's just a chart from Barnowski and co-authors, illustrating the idea of the Sixth Extinction, that there have been these 5 previous mass extinctions in Earth's history, and the criteria for that is 75% of all species becoming extinct. And that, in fact, we should be concerned that the way that we humans are changing the Earth is likely to lead to a 6th extinction. That is 75% of all species becoming extinct. And they break that down, they're illustrated here with a number of groups of animals and plants, and the numbers in white represent the percentage of the species in that group that are currently extinct, and the numbers in black show the percentage that are endangered with extinction. So I started reading into this literature quite a bit, had Extinction on the Brain, and thinking about the pupfish, freshwater fishes in North America during the 20th century experienced 57 extinctions of species or subspecies, which places their North American freshwater fishes, places them with an extinction rate that is nearly 900 times the background rate, what we would expect to see across that period. And I also was aware that the first species ever to be removed from the endangered species list by reason of extinction was a pupfish. It was the Tacopa pupfish, which lived in a spring system on the outside the park boundaries on the east side of Death Valley, about a 40-minute drive from Devil's Hole. So with all this extinction on the brain, things were also, I was realizing in my sources, I had all this material about how the pupfish was at risk for extinction. And the most recent and rigorous of those is from Stephen Bessinger, who's a researcher at UC Berkeley, and he used a population viability analysis to suggest that the risk of the pupfish becoming extinct in 20 years was about 25%. But there were other people worried about the extinction of the pupfish before that. Of course, I had one correspondent tell me a few years ago, 8 years ago, that when I emailed them asking if they had any records about the pupfish, they said they had been expecting to hear any day now that the Devil's Hole pupfish is extinct, and maybe you would tell us that it is. I hope not, but I'm afraid that it is fading away and that you may be preparing its obituary. So this extinction narrative continues. James Deacon, who's a great pupfish researcher for many decades, he at one point when the pupfish population was really low, he was quoted in the newspaper as saying, hey, the best case scenario is we'll figure out the problem and the population will rebound. Obviously, the worst case is extinction in the next 8 months. But these comments about extinction at Devil's Hole went back much further. in 1937, a student named Robert Miller, who later became a really prominent ichthyologist at the University of Michigan, but at this point was an undergraduate. He wrote a letter to another senior ichthyologist named Carl Hubbs, who later became his graduate advisor and father-in-law. And he wrote, Miller wrote that based on his recent trip to Devil's Hole, that Devil's Hole pupfish was found to have been reduced not more than 50 or 60 fish. At this rate, it won't be long until they are extinct. Okay, so I came to UC Santa Barbara and basically dove into this literature about extinction. And then I dove into the pupfish and realized that there's extinction swirling around Devil's Hole, that many of the close genetic and geographic relatives of the pupfish had become extinct, and that we were at the outset of perhaps a sixth mass extinction in Earth's history. And I have students writing in 1937, only 7 years after the pupfish was identified as a unique species, that it is about to become extinct. Yet, as I sat there, I also realized that the pupfish was still there. And it was still in Devil's Hole. And that's when I realized what the question for this book is. It's not why is the Devil's Hole pupfish rare? Why is the pupfish endangered? It's how has this fish managed to survive? And that's what I've really tried to focus the book around, is a story about how the fish has survived. And my big answer to that question is the Devil's Hole pupfish has survived the 20th century and into the 21st century through its relationship with people, with humans. Cheekily, I guess, in the introduction, I say the Devil's Hole pupfish has survived by becoming cosmopolitan. And so that's what the big picture for my work has been, is figuring out how have the relationships between different groups of people resulted, or enabled anyway, the pupfish to persist into the 21st century. All right, I'm just going to take a quick drink of water here. Okay, so let's move into section 2 here, which is kind of a review. I just want to hit some of the high points on how I think this relationship between the pupfish, Devil's Hole pupfish, and people has evolved, how we've become kind of enmeshed together. And so I initially actually wanted to call the book Persistence. And I use this image also in the book. This is James Deacon again. And he is shown here. He worked as a contractor for the Park Service in the 1970s when they were making a number of efforts to save the fish from extinction as the water level had declined. And I'll explain why. But I just love this image of him looking totally exhausted in front of a whole bunch of research and management projects in the background. There's a bank of lights that has been suspended over Devil's Hole. You can't see it, but beneath the surface, there's a submerged second shallow shelf a piece of fiberglass suspended by styrofoam to try and expand the breeding habitat. And there's also a USGS water recorder in the image that's recording this water level decline. And so this image really speaks to me as suggesting the intense lengths that we've gone to attempt to protect this species. All right, but before we get there, I want to start with one of the partial answers to this big question: how has the pupfish survived? Is through the pupfish's relationship to science, and in particular to biologists in the early 20th century who identified the Devil's Hole pupfish as a unique species. Now, that may seem like a self-evident thing, but what I learned from digging into this story is that this was not inevitable, and that we should try and understand the particular interests of the group of biologists who arrived at Devil's Hole, as well as their methods, in order to understand how they came to see the Devil's Hole pupfish as a unique species, and then how that unique species status has played a role in its subsequent conservation. And so here on this slide is a photograph I took at the Smithsonian of 4 of the first 4 jars of pupfishes collected around the Ash Meadows area, this area around Devil's Hole. And the jar second from the left, is the first ever 10 specimens of pupfish from Devil's Hole that were ever collected in March of 1891. I've got another image of that here. This is kind of imagine yourself looking down this jar and into this jar of alcohol that acts as a preservative. And you can see a few of the specimens of now 125-year-old pupfish at the time preserved in this alcohol, along with what we would now call the metadata. That is the information that goes along with these specimens and explains, where they're from and what they are. And they store those in the jar. And so the reason why collecting pupfish is important is because the method that was used by biologists to tease apart species to try and track their evolution and their relatedness, it depends on having dead pupfish or preserved pupfish. So here's Carl Hubbs sitting at his lab bench. And again, he was Robert Miller's advisor, and he was involved in a lot of different issues in ichthyology across the early through. He passed away in the late 70s, but he was involved in pupfish issues for many years. And here he is at his lab bench, and what is he holding in his right hand? Here's a detail of that image. He's got a pair of calipers, and so measuring pupfish or measuring any fish. I don't actually know what species he's holding in his hand. Can't exactly tell, but measuring fishes is how you sort of sort them apart into groups, and it's through this particular method that this group of scientists is interested in using in order to understand evolutionary relatedness, that the Devil's Hole pupfish became seen as unique. So again, going back to this map from that I showed at the start of the talk. We can see these are the different, each little arrow shows a different population that has been identified as unique, and that is all based on the work of Robert Miller in his dissertation. He explored all the pupfishes of the Death Valley region, and he said at the end of all this work, at the end of taking measurements on thousands and thousands of pupfish from across the region, he said, Devil's Hole pupfish is the most unique among this group, presumably because of its time, its isolation time. But we can come back to that question in the Q&A if you'd like. So anyway, it's by being determined to be unique that served as a justification for its protection later on. And so this comes to one of the other partial answers to this big question of how has the pupfish survived, and it's partly through its relationship to the National Park Service. I mentioned in 1952 that Devil's Hole was added to Death Valley National Monument, but in 1950, when the Park Service first looked at this possibility of protecting Devil's Hole, they decided firmly that it was not in the Park Service's interest to add the 40 acres around Devil's Hole to Death Valley or to create it as its own national monument. Basically, the attitude from the director down to the superintendent of Death Valley was that this was an issue for scientists, and that was not an issue for the Park Service. That the Park Service should be engaged in preserving landscapes for the enjoyment of the people. But this was kind of a minutia that they couldn't be responsible for. Well, Carl Hubbs got wind of that and wrote a letter back to Newton Drury, the director of the Park Service, and this is an image of that letter from the National Archives. And he wrote in it was a pretty good burn. He wrote, "Perhaps I have been naive in assuming that preservation of nature was among the basic reasons for and functions of the Park Service, National Park Service. I would hate to think of it, your department, as only a national playground service." This basically forced the Park Service to do a 180. They decided to request that President Truman add it to Death Valley National Monument, and really change the relationship of the Park Service to the pupfish, and has played like a crucial role in the species persistence ever since. One of the more, I'll just finish this section with mentioning one of the more challenging issues that related to our relationship to the pupfish has been over water. And so in the late 1960s, a rancher began operating a large cattle ranch around Devil's Hole throughout Ashimotos. And in this image, which is actually two photographs pasted together from the Bureau of Sport Fisheries and Wildlife, the forerunner of today's Fish and Wildlife Service, you can see not only the cattle and the alfalfa and so forth, but also the electric pumps that were used to pump groundwater. And the pumping of groundwater in the Ashimotos region very quickly resulted in the lowering of the water level in Devil's Hole itself. And this is an image taken by a Park Service employee at Devil's Hole in 1970, and it shows the USGS water level recorder and stilling well in the hole, but it's actually become exposed. It's no longer serving its purpose of measuring the water level, and it declined so quickly that USGS had to come back out and actually install a different recorder in a different part of the hole. And so, at first blush, this is really showing how our institutions were not capable of forming a relationship with the pupfish that would enable its survival. This would expose the shallow shelf that the pupfish need and result in their certain extinction. In one of the most heartening sections of the book to write about and to learn about was the role of government employees, field employees, first of all, noticing that this was going on, and then secondly, organizing and basically forcing the hand of their managers and supervisors to actually do something about it. And so in this photograph taken in May of 1970 by a cow fishing game biologist named Phil Peaster, you can see an assembled group of employees from the Bureau of Sport Fisheries and Wildlife, California Fish and Game, Nevada Fish and Game, the National Park Service, as well as university scientists, all gathered around Devil's Hole, talking about how is it that we are going to protect this species from extinction. There's a lot to say about how they tried to do that, but one of the most important ways was by forcing the hand of the Interior Department and the Department of Justice to bring a lawsuit against the rancher, which ultimately resulted in a victory at the Supreme Court, wherein the court ruled that the Park Service, by virtue of reserving the land around Devil's Hole, had a right to enough water to support the species' survival, even if that was to the detriment of the rancher. And this involves a legal doctrine called Federal Reserve water rights. The Devil's Hole pupfish had been on the endangered species list. They were on the first list, but the Endangered Species Act wasn't passed until 1973, or the modern Endangered Species Act wasn't passed until 1973, at which point this case had already been in court for 2 years. And so the ESA didn't actually play a major role in this fight, and it didn't involve anything like the rules over Section 9 or anything like that. So this is a nice note I found in the archives in the Hubbs papers that scripts that Carl Hubbs had saved. He was at a conference with Robert Miller in June 1976 in Alaska, and Phil Peaster, this cow fishing game biologist, called the University of Alaska and forced someone to write down this note and hand it off to Hubbs, who rose, interrupted the meeting that they were in and rose to say that the Supreme Court had decided 9-0 in favor of the pupfish. So this represented a major shift in the relationship between people and the pupfish. There have been some major ups and downs, however, since that time, even despite the foundational roles that science, park policy, and water rights have played in allowing the preservation or the persistence of the pupfish. Pupfish population began dropping for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious in the mid-1990s. And the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife had to, in some ways, rebuild their relationship to one another, and also their dedication to sort of funding the protection of the pupfish. But there has been a really wonderful rededication to that task, I think. And one of the ways, representations of that is a facility that was built near Devils Hole to be a replica of the habitat, and also as a wet lab, and to basically create a backup Devils Hole. And so in this image here, I'm standing there with the then manager of the facility, looking at this area that had been, the way they built it, to create a replica of the shallow shelf where pupfish reproduce in the actual habitat. I can talk more about that and how it was funded and all that in the Q&A if people are interested. But I think I'll just finish this talk here with just a couple things to say about the pupfish and climate change. So we already know, and kind of I've talked about how the pupfish need the water on this shallow shelf. But in fact, this is maybe even more important as we experience climate change, since research by a researcher named Mark Hausner has shown that the temperature on this shallow shelf can spike above the thermal limit for reproduction during periods where it's especially hot in the Amargosa Desert. And so as the ambient temperature in the desert, in the area around Devil's Hole rises, the number of days where it's suitable for reproduction on this shallow shelf may actually be declining. And one of the other tests or simulations that Hausner ran was to see, well, would this thermal limit be passed if the water level in Devil's Hole is actually higher? And what he found is that if you increase the water level, it serves as a buffer for these higher temperatures. And in fact, you wouldn't see a decline even with increased air temperature. You're not going to see a decline in the number of days that are available for pupfish reproduction, which is very critical for a species that's short-lived. I mean, pupfish only live for about a year. So this is one of the concerns right now at Devil's Hole. But I'd like to kind of tie that into two charts from a recent USGS report, which kind of in some ways illustrates this problem. So for now, don't pay attention at all to the graph at the bottom that in orange. Just look at the top graph, and this shows the water level in Devil's Hole across from 1900 to 2020. And in the green line that runs all the way across the top of the chart is a essentially imagines Devil's Hole's water level as if the rancher had never began pumping there. Any other regional pumping had occurred from the groundwater. And then in yellow and the little white circles, you can see the actual water level in Devil's Hole. And there in that gap represents some of what this concern about the water level over the shallow shelf is right now. And it also, I think the yellow line suggests the our ability to change, for the pupfish to be incorporated into our institutions. We can see with the decline represents the period where the rancher was able to pump from that aquifer, but its recovery represents our ability to think about the requirements of the pupfish to survive. And you can see that dashed line across the middle showing the Supreme Court minimum water level. And then one more slide to just share before concluding is similar, but sort of projects into the future. And so this is also from the same USGS publication, Halford and Jackson. And it captures the decline in recovery in water level and Devil's Hole. It does it in a slightly different way. It doesn't include natural variations in the aquifer, but it projects out into the future what the likely scenarios are. So if all pumping had ceased in 2019, the light green line would remain stable. Whereas if all pumping continues in the region, not immediately around Devil's Hole, in the region, water level is likely to decline by 1/10 of a foot per decade to the end of the century. And so I would say, based on our relationship with the pupfish, this history of becoming enmeshed with one another, people and the pupfish, it's this space in between the business as usual line and the no pumping line that will be, we'll have to see where we end up based on how we're able to modify our relationship to the pupfish through water, over the next many decades. I'll end there and stop sharing my screen, and I would look forward to any questions you have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kevin. We indeed do have some questions.
Great.
And the first one is, one viewer asked, how can we get a copy of the environmental history recovering the Devil's Hole pupfish? Is it online?
Yeah, well, the book is available, wherever you get books, I guess. It was published through the University of Nevada Press, so it's available. The report, you probably have to go through the Park Service. That is a little more,
Okay.
unless you're involved in those issues. It's not quite as thrilling.
Well, some of our people might be involved in the issue.
Yeah.
We need to get a copy for the archives.
Yeah.
I'll have to go through our contacts there. We have another question. Has any consideration been given to turning Devil's Hole over to the Fish and Wildlife Service?
Oh man, that is yes. Well, first of all, it is to say that the Fish and Wildlife Service was the first agency to ever consider protecting ash meadows, and that occurred as early as 1937, when it was still the Bureau of Biological Survey at the time. But what the idea that the Bureau of Biological Survey and then the Fish and Wildlife Service had was to establish the area, because it does have a number of other springs, to establish the whole area as a migratory bird refuge, which would have, of course, required manipulating the water quite substantially, and may have actually been pretty detrimental to some of the other native species in the area. Maybe not Devil's Hole. But J. Clark Salyer was a student of Carl Hubbs, and the evidence I have is that someone proposed it to him, to Salyer, and he said, "No, we're not doing that." So
oh no,
that's the first time the Fish and Wildlife Service thought about it. But then after the Fish and Wildlife Service began managing ash meadows as a national wildlife refuge, Devil's Hole is kind of this Park Service little 40-acre patch on ash meadows, and there was some discussion of turning it over then. But I think in many ways the Devil's Hole pupfish is in a stronger position if more agencies are paying attention and have to cooperate. And so I don't actually know if that would be. And many of the when it was proposed in the 80s, many of the biologists were against it.
Okay. Well, now the questions are pouring in like crazy, so we're gonna have to extend this for another hour and a half, but we'll get to a few of them. Dan from Ruby Valley, Nevada asks, at Ruby Lake National Wildlife Refuge, relict dace, am I pronouncing that fish name right?
Yeah.
Are the only native fish, and they've been almost wiped out due to stocking sport fish. Do you have any advice on what can be done despite strong pressure for fishing here? It's a slightly different example than the Devil's Hole Pupfish.
Yeah, though pupfish are very, as a group, are of course sensitive to the introduction of sport fishes as well. And with some other species, they have had to, even in Ashimotos, there was a lake that was, sport fish were introduced to this lake that then was affecting this other pupfish species. And so basically they've introduced, gates. I mean, sort of classic techniques. I don't think there's a magic bullet. They were able to exclude, I think it was bass from part of the habitat, basically. I know that, like in California with the Owens pupfish, they've also used gates to basically protect headwaters of streams where the downstream end still has sport fish in it.
Cool. Here's another one. Than from USGS asks, any implications here from the WOTUS debate? I'm not sure I know what that acronym means. Do you? WOTUS?
It's not popping out at me. Of the United States. TUS.
Yeah. We'll have to, Than, you're going to have to tell us what that acronym means, and we'll come back to that question.
Waters of the US.
Waters of the US debate.
I may not know enough about that, if that's a specific debate. I mean, I think that the principles at stake that are relevant in the pupfish related to water really do have to revolve around the Federal Reserve water rights. And so the novelty of one of the novelties of the pupfish case was that the Federal Reserve water rights had never been extended to groundwater resources. So that's like the hook. That was the novelty, and it's the Capert versus U.S. case, and that's the most significant sort of piece of the case to any other species or habitats.
Okay. Armand asks, have they identified other pools in the surrounding desert area where the Devil's Hole pupfish occurred in the past? And is there any hope of revitalizing those pools to introduce the species?
Yeah, so the Devil's Hole pupfish seems to have evolved specifically in Devil's Hole, and it did. So you can imagine that in the past, like, so what we know about the Pleistocene in this area is that there is more water, is wetter, and so there were likely a number. The idea is basically that all these pupfish species kind of got isolated in different habitats as the Holocene. Basically things dried out in the Southwest. So the Devil's Hole pupfish, how long it's actually been in this habitat is a matter of contention, which with serious management implications. So it's not the case that there are other habitats that once existed that had Devil's Hole pupfish, but it is the case that how long you think it's actually been in there may have some bearing on how you might protect it in the future.
Cool. Here's one that directly relates to your presentation. Noel asks, does it seem that groundwater pumping or increasing temperatures are the biggest threat to the pupfish going forward?
I mean, I think they're sort of synergistic, right? I mean, they're working together, and I kind of raise them at the end of the talk together because I think it shows some of the difficulty. So increasing temperatures are only important in the context of thinking about what the water level is like in the hole. And I think that to me, that's important to illustrate because it's not just about the number of parts per million, right, of CO2 in the air. It's how are we making decisions on a local level about our groundwater resources and how those interact. So I think it's a sobering report from those two USGS scientists suggesting that in some ways the best case scenario is flat water level, and that in fact we may continue to, it's possible to see decline. But yeah.
You have had viewers from California and Las Vegas all the way east to Cape Cod. So congratulations, Kevin, for great geographical diversity. Glenn from Cape Cod asks, in the book Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Colbert, she covered the challenges of replica environments. What do you think of the cost versus benefits of this?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I enjoyed Under a White Sky, and she used some of the report I wrote for the Park Service to tell her story about Devil's Hole and about this replica place. I think that but one of the things I don't believe she talked about is how that thing was funded, and that was through. I feel like I can say this. I'm allowed to say the whole name of the act because this is, there are probably some people who know all this law. The Southern Nevada Public Lands Management Act of 1998 basically allowed for the sale of land in the Las Vegas Valley, lots of land. And instead of all the money from the sale of that land going back to the U.S. Treasury, which is common in public land sales, Harry Reid and the Nevada delegation contrived to have all of that money stay in Southern Nevada. And 85% of it, I think it's 85%, needed to be used for conservation projects. So in some ways, the boom in Las Vegas real estate, the expansion in demand for water in Las Vegas that we've seen is also paid for the creation of this fish facility, because it was the Fish and Wildlife Service applied for money from SNPLMA to pay for the facility. And so it had a cost. It cost $5 million, but it was also basically money generated by us increasing sprawl in Las Vegas, which creates like an interesting contradiction, or at least tension.
Feedback loop.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, Kevin, we're just about out of time, so I've got to ask you a question. I hadn't seen that presentation till like all the audience. I watched it. Those little preserved specimens in the Smithsonian, was that T.S. Palmer's name I saw on the side of that?
Yes, it was. Like. Mark. Yeah.
So he's one of our heroes, and I've got a picture, one of my favorite things in the archives, I'll share, of T.S. Palmer, probably on the Death Valley expedition when he gathered these, I would guess. And here he is. You'll see in just a second. He is his name is underneath him, T.S. Palmer, looking like an extra from Gunsmoke or Deadwood on that 1891 expedition to the Death Valley. And you did such a nice job of mentioning the Bureau of Biological Survey and that. I thought we'd share this. We just got this fairly recently.
That's awesome. Yeah. Palmer was only 23 in that photo. And he looks older, but he,
the beard.
He made that. He made that first collection. And, the other, I'll finish. I'll say that I also call the pupfish, since the 1890s, the pupfish is a federal fish. It not only did it have our environmental laws help protect it, federal research enabled the sort of discovery of its uniqueness in this particular way. And I think that's really interesting.
That's very cool. There were a lot of connections there. Phil Peaster used to teach in our fisheries academy out here for many years. Great guy. Mark Barrow and I were grad students together at Harvard many years ago. He was the author of Nature's Ghosts. We were grad students in the history of science department there. Just love the presentation. Very stimulating. Thank you so much, Kevin. This was wonderful. We also want to thank those of you who took the time to tune in and watch this. And then finally, I want to thank the crew that made this distance broadcast possible, our crack experts behind the scenes, Doug Canfield, Melissa Gonzalez, Rob Garfinkel, and Randy Robinson. We really appreciate it. And this was wonderful, Kevin. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the wonderful questions.
All right.